The state of air quality in India today can be characterized as quite poor. Um, New Delhi has consistently ranked as the city with the worst air quality, competing quite often with Beijing. But it's not just New Delhi. Large parts of India currently face air pollution that exceeds national ambient air quality standards by a factor of 3 to 5, and air pollution that is almost 10 times the World Health Organization's recommended limits. The global burden of disease in 2015 estimated that air pollution is responsible for prematurely killing more than 1.2 million people annually in India. So that tells us that the state of air in India is quite bad. India has made substantial progress in addressing transport related air pollution. Just this April 1st of 2017, Bharat Stage 4 emission standards went into effect all across India. These standards cut emissions from new vehicles by anywhere between 50 to 80% compared with vehicles that were sold up to this point. It is accompanied by clean low sulfur fuel of grade 50 parts per million sulfur fuel. In addition to that, India is now starting to promote electric drive vehicles as well as hybrid vehicles that will have lower pollution impact. And yet, a lot remains to be done. The biggest challenge that India faces in addressing transport related emissions is dramatic growth in transport demand. As the Indian economy grows, the need for mobility, both of people and goods, is increasing at very high rates. As a result, controlling the emissions from resulting vehicular traffic has become of paramount importance. The main challenges that India has is to ensure that new vehicles that come into the market are clean, existing vehicles that are on the road continue to remain clean throughout their useful life. Older, dirtier vehicles are retired as early as they can be retired. And slowly but surely, a transition to electric drive vehicles is made so that vehicular emissions could be minimized. Diesel emissions from both light and heavy duty vehicles are a major contributor to worsening urban air quality in India. One of the important steps that India has taken recently is to provide clean, ultra low sulfur fuel and diesel fuel across the country, and along with it, introduce Bharat Stage 4 emission standards for both passenger as well as commercial vehicles. More recently, the Supreme Court in India, which had temporarily banned sales of diesel vehicles in the National Capital Region, has now allowed those vehicles to be sold, but taxed at a higher rate. And that fund from the taxation of those vehicles are being used for air quality management purposes. Uh, there are now policies under consideration for early retirement of older diesel commercial vehicles. Many cities currently ban entry of heavy commercial vehicles, which are almost always running on diesel, inside the city limits before 10 p.m. at night and after 8 a.m. in the morning. Uh, these are sort of scattered range of responses to addressing diesel emissions. One of the great advances that will happen in the coming years is India will transition to Bharat Stage 6 emission standards. These are stringent emission standards that, if implemented properly, will reduce diesel NOx emissions from new vehicles by up to 80%. But the experience from European Union suggests that India could falter in implementation of these standards. As the experience from European Union, but also from China suggests that stage 4 and stage 5 emission control vehicles have had emission controls that haven't worked well in practice. And in the case of Euro 6 light duty vehicles, it seems that those vehicles are also having trouble maintaining low NOx emissions on road, even though these vehicles seem to pass all the tests. So India's challenge will be to learn from the failures of the European Union experience and ensure that adequate in-use testing is performed for all new diesel vehicles. That will include strengthening of the laboratory and real driving emissions-based tests, but also instituting an in-use emissions test program. This is to ensure that the emissions of the vehicles remain low throughout their useful life. Vehicular emission control program in India has traditionally lagged European Union and the United States by a number of years. The good part about this is it allows India to learn from experiences in those places. Uh, One of the most important lessons that India could be learning from the current European experience is to ensure that the new diesel vehicles, be they light passenger cars or heavy commercial vehicles and buses, are as clean as they can be, which means diesel vehicles with a functioning particulate filter and an adequate nitrogen oxides emission control system that functions in practice. The second thing that India could learn is to have an adequate in-use compliance program. This is something that India lacks at present. There is no current program that tests on the road in-use vehicles to ensure that their emissions performance throughout their useful life remains as low when they were new to begin with. That program, coupled with warranty requirements, recalls for heavily polluting vehicles, will form the basis of a much stronger compliance and enforcement program that India needs to enforce. While it's important to focus on new vehicles, India also has got a stock of quite old commercial vehicles that could be contributing from half to two-thirds of the particulate matter pollution in certain cities. Therefore, it is important to accelerate scrappage of these older, dirtier diesel vehicles. When coupled with introduction of Bharat Stage 6 emission standards and scrappage of these older vehicles, some of our studies have suggested that we could be saving upwards of 400,000 lives as a consequence of doing that. The final thing I would say that India can learn from the global experience is that transition to really clean zero emission technologies does take a lot of time and patience and perseverance. With that in mind, it's important that India starts to put itself on the trajectory to deploy zero emission vehicles in greater numbers so that when the market is really ready to take these technologies on, its supply could be ramped up. At present, India's compliance and enforcement program can be described as an average program. It, India has got very strong and effective testing network, independent laboratories that are capable of performing tests consistent with world-class emission standards. On the other hand, the process for conformity of production of vehicles in India is highly non-transparent. There is little or no data available on test parameters and emissions of vehicles being tested. India completely lacks any sort of a in-use compliance testing program, a program under which manufacturers would test their own vehicles that have been on the road and report any problems with vehicle emissions. India also lacks authority to have mandatory recalls for heavily polluting vehicles. as well as supporting data infrastructure, whereby manufacturers would report problems with emissions related warranty claims and so on. So, India has got a lot of room for improvement when it comes to its compliance and enforcement efforts. One of the positive developments this year is that the government is now requiring vehicle manufacturers to disclose the type approval emissions test results to the customers at the point of purchase. Uh, Now, this information, which was up till now not available, could be used by third party testing agencies to verify the claims that manufacturers are making about vehicle emissions. In the coming years, especially with the implementation of Bharat Stage 6 emission standards, real driving emissions or portable emissions monitoring equipment based tests will be effective. These tests should hold the manufacturers responsible for the emissions performance of their vehicles in real world on road conditions rather than just the laboratory conditions. Uh, Once India establishes these tests fully and extends the boundary conditions so that they really test the vehicles across a broad range of operating conditions, that will force much more robust developments of vehicle emission control systems. With implementation of Bharat Stage 6 emission standards, India will have very sophisticated emission controls technologies and ultra low sulfur fuels. What is necessary is to educate and prepare the customers and the drivers of these vehicles to ensure that these pretty expensive emission control devices operate effectively throughout the vehicle's useful life. The second important thing, apart from education, is going to be stepping up the compliance and enforcement activities uh, before production, during production, and post production of vehicles. In particular, it is important to stress this post production related compliance activities, which is where India currently lacks a lot of effort. Finally, I would say is to make use of the technologies that are now embedded in newer vehicles, in particular the onboard diagnostics, and use it effectively for inspection and maintenance purposes. Gather and test against the information from onboard diagnostics to identify heavily polluting vehicles so that the ultra low emission vehicles that come into the market starting 2020 continue to perform to the best of their ability.